Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and we are up to chapter 5. Now, all the rest of this book, until this point, has been scene setting. The old Bishop of Barchester peacefully dies. His son does not get the job. He's too late to ask it of the outgoing political ministry and parliament. A stranger gets the job. We have to be brought up to speed on what happened to the warden, Mr. Harding, and to his daughter, Eleanor Bold. And then we have to meet the new bishop, Dr. Prouty, and his wife, Mrs. Prouty, and his personal chaplain, Mr. Slope. We have to meet those people, and Trollope has to give us these bravura chapters, giving us an overview of what they're like and what we can expect from them in the narrative. Now, we get those characters finally saying things and interacting with the world. Now, the proper business of the novel begins with chapter 5, which is called A Morning Visit. It was known that Dr. Prouty would immediately have to reappoint to the wardenship of the hospital under the Act of Parliament to which allusion has been made, but no one imagined that any choice was left to him. No one for a moment thought that he could appoint any other than Mr. Harding. Mr. Harding himself, when he heard how the matter had been settled, without troubling himself much on the subject, considered it as certain that he would go back to his pleasant house and garden. And though there would be much that was melancholy, nay, almost heartrending, in such a return, he was still glad that it was to be so. His daughter might probably be persuaded to return there with him. She had indeed all but promised to do so, though she still entertained an idea that the greatest of mortals, that important atom of humanity, that little god upon earth, Johnny Bold, her baby, ought to have a house of his own over his head. Such being the state of Mr. Harding's mind in the matter, he did not feel any peculiar interest in the appointment of Dr. Prouty to the bishopric. He, as well as others at Barchester, regretted that a man should be sent among them who was, they were aware, not one of their own thinking. But Mr. Harding was not a bigoted man on any points of church doctrine, and he was quite prepared to welcome Dr. Prouty to Barchester in a graceful and becoming manner. He had nothing to seek and nothing to fear. He felt that it behoved him to be on good terms with the bishop, and he did not anticipate any obstacle that would prevent it. In such a frame of mind, he proceeded to pay his respects at the palace the second day after the arrival of the bishop and his chaplain. He did not go alone. Dr. Grantley proposed to accompany him, and Mr. Harding was not sorry to have a companion who would remove from his shoulders the burden of a conversation in such an interview. In the affair of the consecration, Dr. Grantley had been introduced to the bishop, and Mr. Harding had been there also. He had, however, kept himself in the background, and he was now to be presented to the great man for the first time. The archdeacon's feelings were of a much stronger nature. He was not exactly a man to overlook his own slighted claims, or to forgive the preference shown to another. Dr. Prouty was playing Venus to his Juno, and he was prepared to wage an internecine war against the owner of the wished-for apple, and all his satellites, private chaplains, and others. That's a reference to a Greek myth in which all the gods are gathered at a banquet, and someone throws a golden apple onto the table inscribed, "To the fairest." And all the goddesses squabble over it, and it eventually comes down to Minerva, Juno, and Venus. Nevertheless, it was behooved him also to conduct himself toward the intruder as an old archdeacon should conduct himself to an incoming bishop. And though he was well aware of all of Dr. Prouty's abominable opinions as regarded dissenters, church reform, and the hebdomadal consul, and such like, though he disliked the man and hated the doctrines, still was he prepared to show respect to the station of the bishop. So he and Mr. Harding called together at the palace. His lordship was at home, and the two visitors were shown through the accustomed hall into the well-known room where the good old bishop used to sit. The furniture had been bought at valuation, and every chair and table, every bookshelf against the wall, and every square of the carpet was well known to each of them as their own bedrooms. Nevertheless, they at once felt that they were strangers here. The furniture was, for the most part, the same, yet the place had been metamorphosed. A new sofa had been introduced. A horrid chintz affair, most unprelatical and almost irreligious, such a sofa as never yet stood in the study of any decent high churchman in the Church of England. The old curtains had also given way. They had, to be sure, become dingy, and that which had originally been a good ruby red had degenerated into a reddish brown. Mr. Harding, however, thought the old reddish brown much preferable to the gaudy, buff-colored, trumpery moreen which Mrs. Prouty had deemed good enough for her husband's own room in the provincial city of Barchester. Our old friends found Dr. Prouty sitting on the old bishop's chair, looking very nice in his new apron, and they found, too, Mr. Slope, standing on the hearthrug, persuasive and eager, just as the Archdeacon used to stand. But on the sofa they also found Mrs. Proudie, an innovation for which a precedent might in vain be sought in all the annals of the Barchester bishopric. There she was, however, and they could only make the best of her. The introductions were gone through in much form. The Archdeacon shook hands with the bishop and named Mr. Harding, who received such an amount of greeting as was due from a bishop to a presenter. Keep in mind, Mr. Harding is a very minor church official, being presented to the greatest church official in the country, in the region of Barchester. His lordship then presented them to his lady wife, the Archdeacon first with archdiaconal honors, and then the precentor with a diminished parade. After this, Mr. Slope presented himself. The bishop, it is true, did mention his name, and so did Mrs. Proudie, too, in a louder tone, but Mr. Slope took it upon himself the chief burden of his own introduction. He had great pleasure in making himself acquainted with Dr. Grantley. He had heard much of the Archdeacon's good works in that part of the diocese in which his duties as Archdeacon had been exercised, thus purposely ignoring the Archdeacon's hitherto unlimited dominion over the Archdiocese at large. Fireworks had begun. He was aware that his lordship depended greatly on the assistance which Dr. Grantley would be able to give him in that portion of his diocese. He then thrust out his hand and, grasping that of his new foe, bedewed it unmercifully. Because we've already been told that Mr. Slope has a very wet handshake. He bedewed it unmercifully. Dr. Grantley, in return, bowed, looked stiff, contracted his eyebrows, and wiped his hand with his pocket handkerchief. Nothing abashed, Mr. Slope then noticed the precentor and descended to the grade of the lower clergy. He gave him a squeeze of the hand, damp indeed, but affectionate, and was very glad to make the acquaintance of Mr. Harding. He had not exactly caught the name. Precentor in the cathedral, surmised Mr. Slope. Mr. Harding confessed that such was the humble sphere of his work. Some parish duty as well, suggested Mr. Slope, and Mr. Harding acknowledged the diminutive incumbency of St. Cuthbert's. Mr. Slope then left him alone, having condescended sufficiently, and joined the conversation among the higher powers. I don't for a minute believe that Mr. Slope did not know Mr. Harding's name. He made a show of not knowing it to make sure Mr. Harding knew his place. There were 4 persons there, each of whom considered himself the most important personage in the diocese. Himself, indeed, or herself, as Mrs. Proudie was one of them, and with such a difference of opinion as it was not probable they would get on pleasantly together. The bishop himself actually wore the visible apron, and trusted mainly to that and his title, both being facts which could not be overlooked. The Archdeacon knew his subject, and really understood the business of bishoping, which the others did not, and this was his strong ground. Mrs. Proudie had her sex to back her, and her habit of command, and was nothing daunted by the high tone in Dr. Grantley's face and figure. Mr. Slope had only himself and his own courage and tact to depend on, but he nevertheless was perfectly self-assured and did not doubt that he should soon get the better of weak men who trusted so much to externals, as both bishop and archdeacon appeared to do. Do you reside in Barchester, Dr. Grantley? Asked the lady with her sweetest smile. Dr. Grantley explained that he lived in his own parish of Plumstead Episcopi, a few miles outside the city, whereupon the lady hoped that the distance was not too great for country visiting, as she would be so glad to make the acquaintance of Mrs. Grantley. She would take the earliest opportunity after the arrival of her horses at Barchester. Their horses were at present in London. Their horses were not immediately coming down, as the bishop would be obliged in a few days to return to town. Dr. Grantley was no doubt aware that the bishop was at present much called upon by the University Improvement Committee. Indeed, the committee could not well proceed without him, as their final report had now to be drawn up. The bishop had also to prepare a scheme for the Manufacturing Town's Morning and Evening Sunday School Society, of which he was a patron, or president, or director, and therefore the horses could not come down to Barchester at present. Whenever the horses did come down, she would take the earliest opportunity of calling at Plumstead Episcopi, providing the distance was not too great for country visiting. And there, Trollope is intentionally repeating himself in order to mimic the way Mrs. Proudie is talking at the moment. So we don't get her dialogue, but the prose mimics what it sounds like. The Archdeacon made his 5th bow. He made one at each mention of the horses, and promised that Mrs. Grantley would do herself the honor of calling at the palace on an early day. Mrs. Proudie declared that she would be delighted. She hadn't liked to ask, not being quite sure whether Mrs. Grantley had horses, besides the distance might have been, etc., etc. Dr. Grantley again bowed, but said nothing. He could have bought every individual possession of the whole family of the Proudies and had them restored as a gift without much feeling the loss, and had kept a separate pair of horses for the exclusive use of his wife since the day of his marriage. This is the thought going through Dr. Grantley's mind, that he could buy and sell the whole lot of these parvenus. Whereas Mrs. Proudie had hitherto been jobbed about the streets of London at such and such a month during the season, and at every other time had managed to walk or hire a smart fly from the livery stable. Are the arrangements with reference to the Sabbath day schools generally pretty good in your archdeaconry? Asked Mr. Slope. Remember, as we learned yesterday when we had our reading on the Sabbath, Mr. Slope is obsessed with the propriety of the Sabbath. Sabbath day schools, repeated the archdeacon with an affectation of surprise. Upon my word, I can't tell. It depends mainly on the parson's wife and daughters. There is none at Plumstead. This was almost a fib on the part of the archdeacon, for Mrs. Grantley had a very nice school. To be sure, it was not a Sunday school exclusively, it is not so designated, but that exemplary lady always attends there an hour before church and hears the children say their catechism, and sees that they are clean and tidy for church, with their hands washed and their shoes tied. And Griselle and Florinda, her daughters, carried thither a basket of large buns, baked on the Saturday afternoon, and distributed them to all the children not especially under disgrace, which buns were carried home after church with considerable content, and eaten hot at tea, being then split and toasted. The children of Plumstead would indeed have opened their eyes in surprise if they had heard their venerated pastor declare that there was no Sunday school in his parish. Mr. Slope merely opened his eyes wider, and slightly shrugged his shoulders. He was not, however, prepared to give up his darling project. I fear there's a great deal of Sabbath traveling here, he said. On looking at the Bradshaw, that's the train schedule, I see that there are 3 trains in and out on every Sabbath. Could nothing be done to induce the company to withdraw them? Don't you think, Dr. Grantley, that a little energy might diminish the evil? Not being a director, I can't really say, but if you can withdraw the passengers, the company, I dare say, will withdraw the trains, said the doctor. It's merely a question of dividends. But surely, Dr. Grantley, said the lady, surely we should look at it differently. You and I, for instance, in our position. Surely we should do all that we can to control so grievous a sin. Don't you think so, Mr. Harding? She turned to the presenter, who was sitting mute and unhappy. Mr. Harding thought that all porters and stokers, guards, brakesmen, and pointsmen ought to have an opportunity of going to church, and he hoped that they all had. But surely, continued Mrs. Proudie, surely this is not enough. Surely that will not secure such an observance of the Sabbath as we are taught to conceive is not only expedient, but indispensable. Surely, come what might, Dr. Grantley was not to be forced into a dissertation on a point of doctrine with Mrs. Proudie, nor yet with Mr. Slope. So without much ceremony, he turned his back upon the sofa and began to hope that Dr. Proudie had found the place the palace repairs had been such as to meet his wishes. He's not going to debate these things with women or underlings, which is, being the second man in the parish, that's exactly how he thinks of Mrs. Proudie and Mr. Slope. Yes, said his lordship. Upon the whole, he thought so. Upon the whole, he didn't know that there was much grounds for complaint. The architect perhaps might have, in other words, the bishop, Mr. Proudie, was going to say, yeah, the repairs, everything's just fine. But the other people, the other members of this quartet of power have other things to say. But his double, Mr. Slope, who had sidled over to the bishop's chair, would not allow his lordship to finish his ambiguous speech. There is one point I should like to mention, Mr. Archdeacon. His lordship asked me to step through the premises, and I see that the stalls in the second stable are not perfect. Why, there's standing room for 12 horses, said the Archdeacon. Perhaps so, said the other. Indeed, I've no doubt of it. But visitors, you know, often require so much accommodation. There are so many of the bishop's relatives who always bring their own horses. Dr. Grantley promised that due provision for the relatives' horses should be made, for as far at least as the extent of the original stable building would allow. He would communicate with the Archbishop. And the coach house, Dr. Grantley, continued Mr. Slope, there is really hardly room for a second carriage in the larger coach house, and the smaller one, of course, holds only one. And the gas, chimed the lady. There is no gas through the house, none whatever but in the kitchen and passages. Surely the palace should have been fitted through with pipes for gas, and hot water too. There is no hot water laid on anywhere above the ground floor. Surely there should be the means of getting hot water in the bedrooms without having it brought up in jugs from the kitchen. The bishop had a decided opinion that there should be pipes for hot water. Hot water was very essential for the comfort of the palace. It was, indeed, a requisite in any decent gentleman's house. Mr. Slope had remarked that the coping in the garden wall was in many places imperfect. Mrs. Proudie had discovered a large hole, evidently the work of rats, in the servants' hall. The bishop expressed an utter detestation of rats. There was nothing, he believed, in this world that he so much hated as a rat. Mr. Slope had, moreover, observed that the locks of the outhouses were very imperfect. He might specify the coal cellar and the wood house. Mrs. Proudie had also seen that those on the doors of the servants' bedroom were in equally bad condition. Indeed, the locks all through the house were old-fashioned and unserviceable. The bishop thought that a great deal depended on a good lock, and quite as much on the key. He had observed that the fault very often lay with the key, especially if the wards were in any way twisted. Again, we are not getting this in dialogue. Trollope is making no one writes dialogue better than Trollope. He is making the very conscious effort not to give us this in dialogue. Instead, this is just a barrage of complaints being issued to the archdeacon of the diocese about whether or not there are holes in the walls or the gas is on in the upper floors. We are getting this rapid fire in a way that I think Trollope is right to believe if he delivered this in dialogue, it would have slowed the impact. It would have blunted the effect of Dr. Grantley being bombarded, which very much exists now. Mr. Slope was going on with his catalogue of grievances when he was somewhat loudly interrupted by the archdeacon, who succeeded in explaining that the diocesan architect, or rather his foreman, was the person to be addressed on such matters, and that he, Dr. Grantley, had inquired as to the comfort of the palace merely as a point of compliment. He was sorry, however, that so many things had been found amiss. Then he rose from his chair to escape. Mrs. Proudie, though she had contrived to lend her assistance in recapitulating the palatial dilapidations, had not on that account given up her hold of Mr. Harding, nor ceased from her cross-examination as to the iniquity of sabbatical amusements. Over and over again had she thrown out her surely, surely at Mr. Harding's devoted head, and ill had that gentleman been able to parry the attack. He had never before found himself subjected to such a nuisance. Ladies, hitherto, when they had consulted him on religious subjects, had listened to what he might choose to say with some deference, and had they differed in silence. But Mrs. Proudie interrogated him, and then lectured. Neither thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, said she impressively, and more than once, as though Mr. Harding had forgotten the words. They're from Leviticus, or Deuteronomy. It's tough to keep them straight. She's canting Old Testament law at him about the reverence of the Sabbath. She shook her finger at him as she quoted the favorite laws, as though menacing him with punishment, and then called upon him categorically to state whether he did not think that traveling on the Sabbath was an abomination and a desecration. Mr. Harding had never been so hard-pressed in his life. He felt that he ought to rebuke the lady for presuming to talk so to a gentleman and a clergyman many years her senior. But he recoiled from the idea of scolding the bishop's wife in the bishop's presence on his first visit to the palace. Moreover, to tell the truth, he was somewhat afraid of her. She, seeing him sit silent and absorbed, by no means refrained from the attack. "I hope, Mr. Harding," she said, shaking her head slowly and solemnly, "I hope you will not leave me to think that you approve of Sabbath traveling." And she looked at a look of unutterable meaning into his eyes. There was no standing for this, for Mr. Slope was now looking at him, and so was the bishop, and so was the archdeacon, who had completed his adieu on the other side of the room. Mr. Harding therefore got up also, and putting out his hand to Mrs. Proudie, said, "If you will come to St. Cuthbert's some Sunday, I will preach you a sermon on that subject." And so the archdeacon and the presenter took their departure, bowing low to the lady, shaking hands with the lord, and escaping from Mr. Slope in the best manner each could. Mr. Harding was again maltreated, but Dr. Grantley swore deeply in the bottom of his heart that no earthly consideration should ever again induce him to touch the paw of that impure and filthy animal. So we're told that Mr. Harding was again maltreated, and that means he shook hands with Mr. Slope with his wet handshake. "And now, had I the pen of a mighty poet, I would sing in epic verse of the noble wrath of the archdeacon." This is again the narrator stepping in. "The palace steps descend to a broad gravel sweep, from whence a small gate opens out onto the street, very near the covered gateway leading into the close. The road from the palace doors to the left through the spacious gardens, and terminates on the London road half a mile from the cathedral. Till then, they had both passed this small gate and entered the close. Neither of them spoke a word, but the presenter clearly saw from his companion's face that a tornado was to be expected. Nor was he himself inclined to stop it. Though by nature far less irritable than the archdeacon, even he was angry. Even that mild and courteous man, was inclined to express himself in anything but courteous terms. And that is where chapter 5 ends. Trollope has given us a classic case of something that's going to be repeated throughout this novel, including its greatest scene, of a disastrous meeting between characters. Just disastrous. That first meeting is disastrous. It could not have gone worse. And he gives it to us rapid fire. He includes only the dialogue that will illuminate the characters and leaves in the points of the dialogue that won't, but leaves out the dialogue. And when it gets to the end of the chapter, keep in mind, this was serialized. This was in periodical first. And the whole key, believe me, I know a little bit about this, the whole key to writing a serial is that the end of every bit has got to have a little hook in it to keep you wanting to read more. You've got to finish it. If you're publishing something in serialized format, you've got to finish it. You, the reader, has got to finish it saying, I really want the next installment. Ideally, they've got to finish it saying, I really want the next installment, and also write a note to that effect to the editor of the magazine. And this one does, because Trollope, the narrator, tells us, I wish I had the pen of a poet, because the storm of wrath in the Archdeacon's breast would require that level of talent. And he tells us that a tornado is about to break, but he stops the chapter before we get it. That comes next. So that is our chapter for today. We will move on to the next chapter next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.